In this episode, we're going to connect something many beginners think of as purely security work to something privacy engineers care about just as much: how identity and access management, IAM, and authentication choices determine whether personal data stays protected in everyday operations. When people hear IAM, they often picture logins and passwords, but the deeper reality is that IAM decides who can see what, when, and under which conditions, and those decisions shape real privacy outcomes. If the wrong person can access a record, privacy is broken even if the data never leaves the company. If access is overly broad, privacy is quietly eroded through routine overexposure, not dramatic incidents. Hardened authentication reduces the chance of takeover, while hardened authorization reduces the chance of inappropriate internal visibility, and both are needed to treat personal data as something that deserves careful handling. The goal here is to make you fluent in how strengthening IAM can prevent misuse, contain harm, and make privacy promises believable. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.Author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful way to ground this topic is to recognize that privacy failures often look like access failures, even when nobody calls them that. A support tool that shows too much profile detail is an access design problem, not a collection problem. A leaked dataset usually starts with a compromised account or a misconfigured permission, which is a failure of authentication or authorization. A system that lets employees browse sensitive records out of curiosity is not missing a privacy policy. It is missing effective guardrails in IAM. When we harden IAM for privacy outcomes, we focus on reducing unnecessary access, preventing impersonation, and ensuring that every access path has a clear, defensible reason. This matters for beginners because it shifts privacy from an abstract value to an observable property. Who can access data, under what conditions, and with what accountability? Once you see privacy as an access problem, you can design practical controls that work every day. Authentication is the part most people recognize because it answers the question of whether a user or system is really who it claims to be. For privacy, the threat is not only random hackers, but also credential stuffing, phishing, reused passwords, and device compromise, all of which can lead to account takeover. Account takeover is a privacy harm because it gives an attacker the ability to view personal data, change personal settings, or impersonate the person in ways that affect their relationships. Strong authentication reduces takeover risk, but it must be matched to the risk of the action being performed. Logging in to read a public page is not the same as logging in to view payment history, download personal archives, or change recovery settings. A privacy-aware approach treats certain actions as sensitive and requires stronger assurance for those actions, so a single stolen password does not become a master key to someone's life. Multi-factor authentication, MFA, is one of the most visible upgrades because it adds another proof beyond a password, but it is important to understand it as a privacy control, not a mere security checkbox. If MFA prevents takeovers, it prevents unauthorized access to personal data, and that directly reduces exposure and coercion risks. However, MFA choices matter because some factors are easier to intercept or socially engineer than others, and attackers often target the weakest link. For privacy outcomes, the principle is that stronger factors should protect the most sensitive actions, and fallback methods should not quietly undermine the whole system. Recovery is especially important because many takeovers happen through recovery flows rather than the main login. If recovery relies on easily guessed personal facts or weak channels, it becomes a privacy failure disguised as customer convenience. Hardened systems treat recovery as a high-risk process that must be both usable and resistant to manipulation. Single sign-on, SSO, can improve both security and privacy when it is used carefully, because it centralizes authentication and can reduce password sprawl across many services. From a privacy perspective, SSO can make access more accountable because identities are managed consistently and access can be revoked in one place when a person leaves a role. It can also improve auditability because login events and authentication context are easier to trace when they flow through a consistent identity provider. At the same time, SSO can concentrate risk because a compromised SSO account can become access to many systems, which increases blast radius if other guardrails are weak. This means SSO should be paired with strong authentication, careful session management, and tight authorization boundaries so central login does not become central exposure. A privacy engineer also cares about what identity data is shared in SSO assertions, because oversharing attributes can expose personal details to services that do not need them. Sessions and tokens matter for privacy because they determine how long an authenticated state persists and how easily it can be reused by someone else. If sessions last too long, a stolen device, a shared computer, or a copied token can become a long window of unauthorized access. If sessions are not bound to reasonable context, an attacker might reuse a token from an unexpected location or device without being challenged. Privacy-oriented hardening emphasizes sensible session lifetimes, re-authentication for sensitive actions, and careful handling of refresh behavior so long-lived access is not granted casually. It also emphasizes protecting tokens from leaking into logs, links, or shared storage, because a token can function like a password substitute. When you hear about breaches where attackers access data without triggering obvious alarms, token misuse is often part of the story. Strong privacy outcomes depend on treating sessions as valuable assets that must be constrained, monitored, and invalidated reliably when risk is detected. Authorization is where privacy often succeeds or fails because it decides what data an authenticated identity can reach. Many organizations default to broad access because it feels efficient, but broad access is the enemy of privacy because it turns personal data into a shared internal resource. Role-based access control, or RBAC, is a common model where permissions are assigned to roles like support, finance, or engineering, and it can be privacy-friendly when roles are narrow and maintained. The failure mode is role sprawl, where roles slowly accumulate permissions until they become all access because it avoids friction. Privacy hardening means pruning roles, designing specialized roles for narrow tasks, and avoiding default permissions that grant access just because someone belongs to a broad team. A system should help employees do their job without granting them an unrestricted view into personal lives. When authorization is disciplined, privacy is protected even when many people work on the same platform. Attribute-based access control, ABAC, can add a layer of privacy protection because it makes access decisions depend on context, not only job titles. Context can include sensitivity labels, whether the request is coming from a trusted device, whether the user is on a secure network, or whether the access is tied to a documented purpose. The privacy advantage is that sensitive data can require stronger conditions, so a credential that is valid in one context does not automatically unlock everything everywhere. ABAC-style thinking also reduces accidental exposure because it encourages decisions like showing less data when confidence is lower or when risk is higher. This can be especially useful for internal tools, where a support agent might be allowed to see a minimal view by default and a fuller view only when needed and justified. For beginners, the key idea is that privacy improves when access requires both identity and context, because that makes misuse harder and makes data movement more deliberate. Hardened IAM also means building clear boundaries between human users and service identities, because automated systems can have enormous access if they are not controlled. A service account that can read an entire customer database is a privacy hazard, because compromising that account yields mass exposure. Privacy-aware design treats machine identities as least privileged actors with tightly scoped permissions tied to specific workloads. It also treats secrets used by services as high-value items that must be rotated, protected, and not shared casually across environments. Another common risk is using the same powerful service identity for multiple purposes, which increases blast radius and makes auditing harder. When you separate service identities and restrict them to specific data needs, you reduce the chance that one compromised component becomes a pipeline for broad data extraction. This is part of privacy hardening because attackers love automation, and automation loves broad permissions unless you design against that tendency. Privacy outcomes also depend on how you handle privileged access, because administrative capabilities can reveal or change sensitive data at scale. Administrators often need powerful tools, but that power must be constrained by process and visibility. A good privacy stance is that privileged access should be rare, time-limited, and attributable to a specific person with a specific reason, rather than being a standing power that anyone can use at any time. If privileged access is always available, it becomes a convenience tool, and convenience quickly becomes casual overreach. Hardened environments treat privileged actions as special events that require stronger authentication, explicit approvals, and detailed logging. This is not about distrust. It is about acknowledging that mistakes happen and that powerful actions create powerful harm. When privilege is controlled, privacy stops depending on perfect behavior and starts depending on reliable structure. Another overlooked part of hardening is reducing personal data in identity systems themselves, because identity directories can become sensitive datasets. It is tempting to store many attributes about users for convenience, such as personal phone numbers, addresses, demographics, and detailed organizational notes. Those attributes can then flow into many applications through SSO and identity federation, spreading personal details beyond what is needed. Privacy-aware IAM limits identity attributes to what is required for authentication and authorization decisions, and it is cautious about distributing attributes widely. It also pays attention to attribute correctness, because identity errors can cause privacy exposure, such as sending notifications to the wrong person or granting access based on outdated roles. Directory hygiene becomes a privacy control when it prevents mistaken identity and reduces unnecessary attribute sharing. By minimizing identity attributes and keeping them accurate, you reduce both the chance of exposure and the chance of unfair outcomes driven by bad identity data. Auditability is one of the most practical privacy outcomes of hardened IAM because it makes access accountable and misuse discoverable. If you cannot tell who accessed what data, you cannot meaningfully protect it, and you cannot respond effectively when something goes wrong. Good auditing records access events, sensitive actions, and data export activity, and ties those events to specific identities and contexts. It also supports investigation without requiring broad access, which is important because investigations themselves can become privacy risks if they involve many people browsing sensitive records. A mature approach uses auditing not only after incidents, but also as a way to detect drift, such as roles that are used too broadly or datasets that are accessed unexpectedly. Beginners should remember that audit logs are not just technical artifacts. They are the evidence that a system can enforce boundaries and learn when boundaries are being tested. When auditing is built in, privacy claims become verifiable rather than aspirational. Hardening also requires attention to how access is granted and removed over time, because permissions naturally grow unless you actively control them. People join projects, gain temporary access, change roles, and sometimes leave organizations, and each change is an opportunity for permissions to persist longer than needed. This is how privacy risk accumulates quietly. Old access becomes hidden access. Privacy-oriented IAM treats access as time-bound and reviewed, so permissions are periodically revalidated and expired when no longer justified. It also treats offboarding and role changes as high-risk moments where access must be updated quickly, because stale access is a common source of internal misuse and external compromise. When access governance is weak, the system can look secure on paper and still be porous in practice. Strong privacy outcomes depend on constant alignment between real roles and real permissions, not on one-time setup. Human factors matter here because attackers often bypass technical defenses by exploiting people, and users often bypass privacy guardrails when workflows are confusing. A phishing attempt that captures credentials is a privacy incident in progress because it is an attempt to access personal data through an impersonated identity. Hardened authentication reduces the success rate of phishing by requiring stronger proofs, but hardened systems also reduce harm by limiting what a compromised account can access. Internal users can also be manipulated, such as support staff being tricked into revealing data or changing account settings for an imposter. Privacy-aware IAM supports staff by ensuring support tools do not rely on personal trivia as proof and by making sensitive changes require higher assurance. This reduces the chance that an attacker can use stolen personal details to convince a human gatekeeper. The system becomes safer when it assumes humans will be pressured and helps them resist that pressure through design. Finally, hardening IAM for privacy outcomes is about aligning the system's identity and access choices with the promises the organization makes to people. If a service claims it protects personal data, then access must be narrow, auditable, and justified, and authentication must be strong enough to prevent routine takeover. If a service claims it limits internal viewing, then authorization must reflect need to know and minimize broad visibility, not merely rely on training. If a service claims it can correct problems quickly, then auditability and access governance must make investigations and containment practical. Privacy is not only about preventing catastrophic leaks. It is about preventing constant low-level exposure and inappropriate use that quietly changes the relationship between people and systems. When IAM is hardened thoughtfully, it reduces both the probability of compromise and the everyday overreach that makes users feel watched. That combination is what makes privacy outcomes durable, defensible, and worthy of trust.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.